So the last topic in this unit is the Phillips curve. It's a graph that actually corresponds pretty much identically with the aggregate model. So if you understand the aggregate model, the Phillips curve should not be hard at all. Like the aggregate model, we have a long run line. This long run Phillips curve goes directly with the long run aggregate supply. They are the same exact concept, and we use it just like in the aggregate model to show full employment, the natural rate of unemployment, potential GDP at the peak of the business cycle when you have no cyclical unemployment. So it's to show all of those different synonyms for long run equilibrium. And we use this line to show how the economy is doing, just like in the aggregate model. So in the aggregate model, we use the LRAS to show a recession by starting it to the right of the short run equilibrium. Same idea with the Phillips curve, but instead of starting the LRPC to the right or to the left, we're going to put a point down along the line closer to the unemployment rate. So this point shows that your unemployment is too high, which you would have if you were in a recession. Then we have inflation. On the aggregate model, we showed inflation by starting the LRAS to the left of the short run equilibrium, where you're unattainable, you're overusing your resources. We could do the same exact idea on the Phillips curve by starting a point up along the line closer to the inflation rate. So what this graph does is take those two concepts in the aggregate model that are very important in measuring the health of the economy, looks at the inflation and looks at the unemployment. And we can use this to set up the graph like I showed you here, or just like with the aggregate model, we can show shifts in aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply on this graph as well. But what's weird about it is there's only one short run Phillips curve line versus in the aggregate model we had aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply. So the aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply shifts are actually going to look different on the same line. So for both of them, you're going to use the short run Phillips curve, but you're going to use them differently based on if it's an aggregate demand shift or a short run aggregate supply shift. So first link, aggregate demand. Before, when we increased or decreased aggregate demand, price level and GDP equilibrium moved in the same direction. So for example, an increase in aggregate demand. Remember, this could be caused by an increase in expansionary fiscal or expansionary monetary policy, because both of those change the GDP, the C for fiscal and the G, and the I for monetary. Both of these would increase aggregate demand, which drives price levels up. So this price level right here directly corresponds with the inflation rate, because remember, an increase in price level is the definition of inflation. So whatever happens to price level happens to the inflation rate over on the Phillips curve. Then on the aggregate model, GDP goes up, which we know when GDP goes up, unemployment goes down. So I'm going to show that decrease in the unemployment rate on the Phillips curve as well. So an increase in aggregate demand has an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. Inflation goes up, unemployment goes down. The Phillips curve shows this by moving up along the short run Phillips curve. So traditionally, this is what the Phillips curve was for, to show the business cycle assumed inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. Because remember, until the 1970s, that's all we thought existed. So that's what they used to use this for in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. Then in the 1970s, we know things got a little crazy. So that's how you show an increase in aggregate demand on the Phillips curve. It's a movement along the line. A decrease in aggregate demand is the same idea. It decreases price levels, so that's why the inflation rate's going down. It decreases GDP, which we know means unemployment goes up, so I'm showing the unemployment rate increasing. So again, to show that inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment, I'm going to move along the short run Phillips curve, but now down along the short run Phillips curve to show that inverse relationship. So aggregate demand shifts move along the short run Phillips curve to show the traditional inverse relationship between price level and unemployment. But then we know the 1970s happened. And for a while, they actually got rid of the Phillips curve because they said it was too simple and it didn't account for short run aggregate supply shifts. But then they brought it back when they figured out they could actually modify the short run Phillips curve to account for those shifts, which is what we're going to do now. So stagflation, which we've talked about a bunch, when resource costs are higher, the short run aggregate supply moves to the left, which is a problem because now not only is inflation going up, but GDP is going down, which means unemployment is going up as well. So now, instead of that inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment, you have a direct relationship between inflation and unemployment. When they brought the Phillips curve back, they were like, wait a minute, couldn't we just show this direct relationship between inflation and unemployment by just shifting the whole Phillips curve out? And that's what they did. And now we have the Phillips curve modified to show stagflation. That's not that complicated, but people mess it up all the time. Because what you notice is a short-run aggregate supply decrease causes the short-run Phillips curve to increase. They shift in the opposite direction. And on this graph, an increase in the short-run Phillips curve is the worst thing you can have in an economy. That's annoying because in every other economics graph we've covered, an increase is a good thing. This is the one graph where an increase is really, really bad. So make sure you're slowing down and reading the aggregate model onto the Phillips curve. It's the easiest one to slip up on because of those two differences. Let's look at an increase in short-run aggregate supply to help it sink in. So we know an increase in short-run aggregate supply moves it to the right, which drives down price levels, meaning, yay, price levels, inflation is lower. It drives up GDP, which drives down unemployment. So where a decrease in short-run aggregate supply was all bad things, an increase in short-run aggregate supply is all good things, which was why we have the whole supply side school of economics. So these two things going down, all good things happening, would shift the entire short-run Phillips curve to the left. So again, a shift in the short-run aggregate supply shifts the entire short-run Phillips curve in the opposite directions. That can be tricky, but if you slow down and just read this graph, you are saying the same thing on the aggregate model and on the Phillips curve. But always think, Phillips curve does not work the same conceptual idea of an increase is a good thing as every other graph in this class. The last thing with the Phillips curve is the long-run Phillips curve. And yes, it is the same idea as the LRAS and works the same exact conceptually. But there is actually one thing that shifts the long-run Phillips curve that we didn't talk about in the aggregate model. It goes specifically with this line, unemployment compensation. So this is a classical graph. Classical economists who don't want the government interfering in the economy say that, for example, when the government stays out supply-side economics, it leads to all good things in the economy, inflation and unemployment decreasing. They also say that when the government does interfere with government handouts like unemployment compensation, it not only affects the short run, but it can actually hurt the long-run economy as well. Because think about it. The idea is this long-run Phillips curve line represents full employment, represents the natural rate of unemployment, which remember, full employment is typically about 4 to 6% unemployed. So classical economists say if the government increases unemployment compensation, that's going to give people less incentive to get off unemployment compensation and get out there and find a job. And if people are staying on unemployment compensation longer, that's going to increase that natural rate from 4% to like 8% natural rate of unemployment as people are staying on unemployment compensation longer. So increasing unemployment compensation decreases the willingness of people to get out there and find a job, which would increase the long-run Phillips curve. That's the only thing that we're going to use to move the long-run Phillips curve. The opposite works in classical economics as well. Classical economists say if the government cuts unemployment compensation, people will be more willing to find a job, and that natural rate of unemployment will fall from like 4 to 2%. Or on the other side of the coin, if they cut unemployment compensation, people will stop qualifying for it and count as nothing at all because then they're discouraged workers. Remember, discouraged workers count as nothing. But either way, whether people find a job or people fall off the grid completely and become discouraged, the natural rate of unemployment will fall, shifting the long-run Phillips curve to the left. So only one thing moves the long-run Phillips curve. It's unemployment compensation, and it moves directly. More unemployment compensation increases the long-run Phillips curve. Less unemployment compensation decreases the long-run Phillips curve. And that is all for the Phillips curve. Have a great day.